Hi, I'm Phil, the advisor for College of the Canyons, and this video is for the European Commission. But before I continue and explain what we're going to be talking about, I'd like the rest of the staff to introduce themselves.
I am Vicky Danktumda. I'm the SecGen for this year's conference.
I am Shannon Kloppenstein. I'll be one of the hosts in this year's conference.
And I am Colin. I'm also going to be a host in this year's conference.
Thank you, guys. Now, what you'll see on the College of the Canyons COCMUN webpage are a number of videos that explain how we're using Zoom, how we're using Discord, and how we're using Google Docs, and how to go back and forth between those platforms. So in order to function well in the European Commission, you're going to need to do that. So please watch those videos and practice with your team. You'll have access to Discord, so you can practice when you're on Zoom with your team. You can use the Discord channels to practice doing all this stuff. What I want to do is I want to talk about the European Commission and what's going to make it unique as a specialized body. Unlike a General Assembly, a GA, there are going to be crisis updates given on an hourly basis. The crisis director is going to come into the meeting and give an update on what's going on. In general, what the crisis director is going to be doing is providing guidance. That is, there are a lot of issues that have to be dealt with on the question of refugees. And if the crisis director and the chairs feel like there's an issue that isn't getting enough attention, they will describe a crisis that's unfolding as a way of sort of steering the committee to think about how to deal with these particular crises. So pay attention to the crisis updates. They are a clue as to where the chair wants you to go on this on your resolutions. Now, when the crisis director comes into the room, the chair will announce that the crisis update is coming. The crisis director will explain what the crisis is, and then usually the delegates will have an opportunity to ask the crisis director some questions using the raise their hand function. The number of questions that the crisis director permits will be up to the crisis director. What we're going to talk about in this video in particular is the authors panel, how that's going to work in a committee. So throughout the committee, as things are going along, you're going to be developing working papers. You're going to be working with one another and trying to figure out ways to address the issue that your committee is dealing with. Once the working papers have been submitted to the dais and then returned back for editing a few times, you'll be notified that the working paper is ready to go. Generally speaking, other working papers will be made available and ready to go at the same time. When we get to that point in the conference, the chair will make the following motion. But before we do that, right now the staff has their videos on and their microphones on. When we're in committee, because we need to reduce the bandwidth, the staff, I want you to turn off your video and mute your microphones. That's what it's going to look like in committee. The delegates are all going to have their videos off. The only one that will be on the screen all the time will be the presiding chair. Okay. So at this point, the chair would say, once now the working papers have all been approved and ready to go, the chair would make the following comment. Delegates, are there any points or motions on the floor? Sweden, to what motion do you rise?
Thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. Sweden motions to introduce all working papers.
That motion is in order. Thank you, Delegate. At the chair's discretion, this is the only motion we're going to entertain. Delegates, we're now going to vote on Sweden's motion to introduce all working papers. Please vote simultaneously. Here you can see that everybody voted yes. That's how the chair will be able to tell what the vote is, and that's why we vote simultaneously. So the chair would say, this motion passes. Are there any points or motions on the floor? Sweden, to what motion do you rise?
Thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. Sweden motions to go into authors panel.
Okay, that motion is in order. Thank you very much. So at the chair's discretion, the chair is going to move us into authors panel to get the process moving along. Now, delegates, what would usually happen is the chair would give all the working papers a little bit of time to figure out who's going to be talking in their authors panel. Now, if you're not familiar with authors panel, what that means is that some of the sponsors are going to come up and explain the resolution that they're going to be working on. There will usually be a set amount of time. For our purposes, we're going to use 1 minute and 30 seconds. It won't usually be that fast. You can get around 5 minutes to explain it. So what the delegates would need to do, chair would usually say, you have 5 minutes to figure out in what order you're going to speak about the draft resolutions and set it up. So we've already done this ahead of time. And so at this point, the chair would say, would the sponsors and the authors panel for HOSMAD, the name of this particular working paper, please come to please turn on your videos. Now, normally the chair would call them to the front of the room, but since we're doing this virtually, now it's going to be a little bit different. So now I know that Sweden, Afghanistan, and India are going to be presenting this working paper. So at one point the chair will say to the sponsors of working paper HOSMAD, delegates, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds. I'll start your time when you begin speaking.
Thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. HOSMAD, we're proud to present the working paper HOSMAD. We've made significant progress in trying to, minimize and eliminate nuclear weapons. Sweden is proud to work with other delegates, including Afghanistan and India on this. Sweden is particularly interested in Clause 6. It's talking about hiring taxes and imposing sanctions on people not complying with the restrictions set by this body in reducing nuclear weapons. It's a way to encourage and involve different countries. It's a way to incentivize different countries to do this.
Thank you, Delegate. Afghanistan wants to highlight clause number 4, in which we urge the establishment of the Joint Nuclear Trust Commission. It's a educational incentive to not only increase education with other member states, but reduce the enmity with the disarmament process. And India, you wanted to add?
Yes, and I was encouraging the amendment of the fissile material cutoff treaty. We wanted to include a 10-year fissile material stockpile reduction plan at a rate of 10% reduction annually, and the IAEA overseeing the disposal of these materials.
Thank you, Delegate. That's all the time we have in this authors panel. Now, what would happen, as soon as they were done, exactly, the staff would the delegates would turn off their videos and they'll mute themselves. And what would happen, since the motion was to introduce all working papers, then the chair would call up the next group and we would repeat the process so that all the resolutions were introduced and everybody had an opportunity to explain it. Now, what can happen in some authors panels is if there's a sufficient amount of time, if let's say you have 5 minutes on the authors panel, what the chairs will sometimes do is allow 2 minutes or 3 minutes for questions, in which case delegates can ask questions. If that's permitted in your committee, then what would happen is when they were done, the chair would let you know, and if you want to ask a question, you use the raise hand function, and the chairs would call on somebody and you would ask a question. It's got to be a discrete question about a particular thing. Don't do a speech about some aspect of the draft resolution. After all the draft resolutions have been, after all the working papers have been discussed in authors panel, right? They're converted to working papers and then they're converted to draft resolutions, and then at some point, when they've all been discussed and been on the floor, then it is time now to go into voting block.